I never thought putting up a simple gate would lead to a full-blown showdown with a wannabe dictator and her pack of fake cops. But that's exactly what happened the day I installed one at my house. It was just a black metal gate. Nothing flashy, nothing out of place. Press a button, it slides open smoothly, clean lines match the trim on my house, and it finally stopped random drivers from swinging into my driveway to turn around, leaving ugly tire marks every time. I'd saved up for months, double-checked the HOA rules, pulled the permits, did everything by the book. My dad's the chief of police, so growing up under his roof, following the rules wasn't optional. That's why I was confident this gate was perfectly legal. But there's always one. In our neighborhood, that one was Mrs. Peterson. You know the type. Tight-lipped, smug, power-drunk. She wore those crisp tennis outfits like armor and treated the HOA rules like her personal law code. It wasn't even 48 hours after the gate was installed when I caught her standing at the edge of my driveway. Broad daylight, no shame, holding her phone up like she was taking photos at a crime scene. I waved, asked her if she needed something. She didn't even answer, just huffed and marched off, those pristine white sneakers clicking down the sidewalk like a drill sergeant on parade. Next day, I found a notice slapped onto my mailbox, bright yellow, screaming in all caps, urgent, unauthorized modification, HOA violation. I stood there staring at it, half expecting someone to jump out from behind a bush yelling, "Gotcha!" But no, this was real. Mrs. Peterson had wasted no time. I figured I'd be the reasonable one. Walked over to her place later that evening, had a folder with every permit and approval I'd collected. Even brought homemade cookies, my mom's peace offering recipe. Before I could ring the doorbell, her front security camera crackled. "I'm documenting everything," Mrs. Peterson's voice snapped over the speaker. "That gate is lowering our property values. The HOA board is meeting about this tomorrow." Emergency session? An emergency meeting, over a gate. I called my dad. He was out of town at a police conference. His advice? Document everything. Keep your cool. Mrs. Peterson's been pulling this garbage since before you were born. Remember when she tried to fine the Johnsons for having a basketball hoop? Yeah, I remembered. What I didn't know was that Mrs. Peterson had already started her campaign against me. While I was installing the gate, she was out knocking on doors, rallying neighbors, passing around zoomed-in photos, telling everyone I was turning my place into a rental property or worse. That night, I got an alert from my security camera. There she was again, this time with two of her HOA board buddies, flashlights in hand, measuring my driveway like they were planning a heist. I watched through the feed as they pointed, whispered, and scribbled in notebooks. That's when I noticed something in her hand, a business card. Elite HOA Enforcement Solutions. Curious, I zoomed in on the footage, snapped a screenshot, and did some digging. My stomach turned. This wasn't some code violation notice. Elite HOA Enforcement was a private security firm known for being intense. We're talking K-9 units, patrol cars. They even wore uniforms that looked uncomfortably similar to law enforcement. And apparently they had a reputation for strong-arm tactics. Then came the text. Mrs. Peterson. Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp. Attendance mandatory. Bring your checkbook. Fines start at $500 per day. I stared out my window at the gate I'd spent months planning for. Gleaming in the streetlights. Perfectly within regulations. But that gate was about to be the front line of a war I hadn't signed up for. And Mrs. Peterson? She had no idea who she was messing with. That night, one more security alert pinged my phone. Mrs. Peterson was back. This time, she wasn't alone. A guy stood next to her, wearing a uniform, writing in a notebook while she pointed at my property. They both turned toward my camera, and Mrs. Peterson smiled. It wasn't friendly. It was that checkmate kind of smile. Only she didn't realize I still had an ace waiting to be played. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of snapping photos. 7 a.m., there she was again, taking pictures of the gate like it was evidence in a felony case. And she'd brought reinforcements. Her entire HOA crew, 5 of them. Pastel cardigans, coffee mugs, all of them shaking their heads like I'd paved my yard in toxic waste. Then the text hit. Emergency HOA meeting. 2 hours. Perfect timing, right? Dad was still out of town. I spent the next hour digging through every document I had: HOA, bylaws, property maps, photos. I knew I was within my rights, but Mrs. Peterson had this way of twisting facts until people believed her. Walking into the community center that evening felt like stepping into a kangaroo court. Except here, the judge, jury, and executioner played doubles tennis every Thursday. Mrs. Peterson was standing front and center, her PowerPoint already loaded. Title slide: The Decline of Our Community Standards. Dramatic, right? She clicked through photo after photo of my gate, edited to look darker, more ominous. "This is just the beginning," she warned. "First it's unauthorized gates. Next it's purple houses and RVs on the lawn." People murmured. I stood up, calm, confident. "According to Section 7.3 of our HOA bylaws," I said, holding up my maps, "automatic gates are allowed as long as they match the home's exterior and don't exceed 8 feet. Mine is 7 feet 2 inches, and it matches my house trim." Silence for about 2 seconds. Then Mrs. Peterson's face flushed bright red. But she wasn't done. She slammed a thick binder on the table. "I have 37 documented instances of this gate disrupting the peace. Motors humming, headlights reflecting, squeaking metal." She passed around photos, some of them taken in the middle of the night. I stayed quiet. Then I pulled up a video from my phone. It showed Mrs. Peterson's sprinklers going off at 3 a.m., blasting water at my windows. "Speaking of disrupting the peace," I said, "should we talk about water waste?" But she wasn't backing down. "The board has already voted," she announced. "We've hired West Valley Security Services. They'll handle this appropriately." That's when I knew this wasn't just posturing. Bob from 2 doors down muttered, "They're serious." My cousin's HOA used them: patrol cars, uniforms, K-9 units. The meeting ended with a threat: remove the gate in 48 hours or face the consequences. Driving home, I figured Mrs. Peterson would get bored. She'd pushed around the Williams family over their basketball hoop. She made the Martins repaint their garage door last year. She always backed off when things got messy. This would be the same, until I pulled into my driveway and saw tire tracks that didn't belong. Under my porch light was a card: West Valley Security Services, HOA Enforcement Division. On the back, first warning. I knew I was in deeper than I thought. Did some digging on West Valley, sketchy history, lots of complaints. But I wasn't ready for what came next. 3 black SUVs pulled onto my street late that night, lights flashing, HOA enforcement painted on the sides. I watched from behind my blinds, heart pounding. Morning came, and so did the barking. Not just any dog. This was a trained K-9, the kind you only see with real law enforcement. 3 black patrol cars blocked my driveway. Mrs. Peterson was there, recording it all on her phone like she was hosting a live news broadcast. "Final warning," a guy in a tactical-looking uniform shouted. "Remove the unauthorized gate within the hour, or we'll be forced to take action." The dog lunged, snarling. I backed away from the window, adrenaline spiking. But I noticed something. Their badges? They didn't glint in the sunlight the way they should. Fake, I knew it. I'd worked summers at Dad's precinct. I opened my laptop, pulled up the county's contractor database. No licensed K-9 units for private security in our district. None. The pounding on my door got louder. "Last chance before we release the dog." Neighbors gathered, whispering. Mrs. Peterson was practically vibrating with excitement. I grabbed my paperwork, dialed Dad's number. "Please pick up." The handler was unclipping the leash when I heard it. The rumble of Dad's cruiser turning onto our street. Mrs. Peterson was too busy filming my front door to notice the squad car rolling up behind them. Lights flashing, Dad's cruiser eased to a stop, and his voice cut through the chaos, clear and sharp through the loudspeaker. "This is Chief Williams. All unauthorized security personnel stand down immediately." And just like that, the show was over. The K-9 stopped lunging and sat down like someone flipped a switch. The guys in tactical uniforms froze, hands hovering over their belts. Mrs. Peterson spun around, and for the first time since this mess started, she looked like someone had just yanked the rug out from under her. Her phone slipped out of her hand and clattered onto the driveway. Dad stepped out of his cruiser, his badge catching the sun, sharp and gold. His uniform crisp. His face? That was the look of a man who'd had just about enough of other people's nonsense. He adjusted his belt and walked straight toward the fake officers, his boots hitting the pavement in a slow, deliberate rhythm that made the entire street go silent. "Show me your K-9 licenses," he said to the lead guy, "and your company credentials." "Now," the guy stammered. "We're with elite HOA enforcement. We were hired by the HOA to—" Dad cut him off. "I didn't ask who hired you. I asked for your licenses." They had nothing. Not a single shred of paperwork. Dad already knew that. He checked before he even got out of the car. But he waited, giving them enough rope to hang themselves. Mrs. Peterson tried to slip away, stepping backward toward her house. Not fast enough. "Ma'am," Dad called without looking at her, "I suggest you stay right there. We've got questions about who paid for this little operation." I was still standing on my porch, holding the property maps, watching all this go down. Neighbors were pouring out of their homes now, phones up, recording everything. The HOA board members who'd backed Mrs. Peterson were suddenly nowhere to be found. Dad motioned to me. "You've been recording this, right?" I nodded, holding up my phone. "Good," he said. "We'll need that." One of the fake officers mumbled something about how Mrs. Peterson had told them the security work was approved by local law enforcement. Dad didn't even blink. "I am local law enforcement, and I didn't approve anything." A second later, two real patrol cars turned the corner. Officers Martinez and Johnson. I'd known them since I was a kid. They'd been to our house for barbecues, seen me graduate. Now they were here in uniform, stepping out of their cars with that same controlled focus my dad had. The fake security guys backed up a few steps, but it was too late. Martinez and Johnson took over, hands on holsters, voices calm but firm. Dad looked at Mrs. Peterson. "We've also found receipts," he said. "Payments made from HOA funds to this so-called security company. Care to explain that?" Her face went pale, then red, then pale again. "I was protecting the community," she stammered. "He's breaking HOA rules." I raised my folder. "Actually, no," I said. "I'm fully compliant. I followed every rule, pulled every permit. What you did, hiring unlicensed security and using HOA funds without a board vote? That's a problem," the crowd murmured. People whispered. Phones kept rolling. Dad's voice carried over the noise. "Impersonating law enforcement is a felony," he said. "These uniforms? Those badges? The K-9 unit? All illegal. And you brought them here, to my house." Martinez and Johnson moved in, cuffing the lead fake officer first, then the rest. Even the dog seemed confused, glancing from its handler to the real cops, as if waiting to be told what to do next. Mrs. Peterson backed up another step, but Dad wasn't done with her. "You'll need to come with us, ma'am. We have more questions down at the station." And just like that, Mrs. Peterson's little empire started to crumble. As they loaded the fake officers into the patrol cars, I spotted Mr. Wilson, the HOA board president, standing on his porch with his arms crossed. He didn't say a word, but I could tell. Mrs. Peterson's reign was finished. But I also knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Later that week, there was an emergency HOA meeting. This time, it wasn't about my gate. It was about Mrs. Peterson. And the stories that came out, I couldn't believe it. She'd forced the single mom 2 streets over to repaint her house. 3 times in one summer, she'd made a veteran take down his American flag because, according to her, it was the wrong shade of red. She fined another neighbor $200 for unsightly holiday decorations. It was one pumpkin on their porch in October. And that wasn't even the worst of it. Mrs. Rodriguez, the sweet older woman who always brought tamales to the block party, stood up and told everyone that Peterson's goons had threatened her with a $500 fine for having wine chimes. She paid it. She didn't want trouble. People started realizing they'd all been bullied, manipulated, over and over. And nobody had spoken up because they thought they were alone. Mrs. Peterson wasn't there to hear it, though. She was already facing charges: impersonating law enforcement, misuse of HOA funds, harassment. Probably more by the time they finished digging through her paperwork. The HOA board voted her out. On the spot, no argument. Wilson took the gavel, banged it once, and said, "She's gone." As Mrs. Peterson stormed out of the meeting, she slipped on the wet grass, fell right into the mud by her flower beds. Some people laughed. I didn't. It wasn't worth it. She'd already lost everything that mattered to her. She didn't need me adding to it. Things changed fast after that. Mrs. Rodriguez became the new HOA president, and instead of cracking down on gates and basketball hoops, she focused on making the neighborhood better, helpful, supportive. My gate? It stayed, approved officially by the new board. And funny enough, it became a bit of a trend. Other people started installing gates just like mine. Security was the new buzzword, and I couldn't help but laugh every time someone mentioned how modern it made the neighborhood feel. The fake security company? They were facing serious charges. Turns out they'd done this in other neighborhoods too. Scared people into paying fake fines, confiscated property. There was even talk about a bigger investigation into HOA abuse across the state. All because Mrs. Peterson picked a fight with the wrong person at the wrong time. And my dad? He got a lot of thank you notes, and a few pies, and he deserved everyone. A month later, I saw Mrs. Peterson one last time. She was loading boxes into a moving van, leaving for good. But before she left, she stood at the edge of my driveway, looking at the gate. For a second, I thought she was going to make another snarky comment. Instead, she pulled out her phone, took a picture of it. I glanced at her screen. She was Googling gate installation companies. Guess she finally came around. Now that black metal gate, it's not just a gate, it's a reminder that standing up to bullies works, that doing things the right way matters, and that no matter how much someone tries to control everything, there's always someone who can outsmart them. And as for Mrs. Peterson, maybe she learned something, maybe she didn't. But one thing's for sure, she's never messing with me again.